It has been argued that the Allied and Soviet policy of unconditional surrender was one of the reasons why the Germans kept fighting, and thus it was a mistake because it prolonged the war. The idea was that it was the Allies and Soviets that refused to accept the prospect of peace for anything other than total surrender, which meant that the Germans may as well fight to the end, hoping for a miracle, since surrender meant dishonour and the destruction of Germany anyway, so may as well do as much damage as possible as they went down. But is this really the case? Did the Allied policy of unconditional surrender prolong the war, or would the Germans have committed to the fight anyway? That's what we're going to figure out today. The original story was that Roosevelt had just randomly come up with the idea of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca conference in 1943, and although he was surprised at first, Churchill believed Roosevelt was right and supported him. But this isn't exactly what happened. In fact, on the 21st of May 1942, the US State Department said this: on the assumption that the victory of the US will be conclusive, unconditional surrender rather than an armistice should be sought from the principal enemy states, except perhaps Italy. The US Chiefs of Staff also recommended the idea of unconditional surrender to the President in the fall of 1942. Roosevelt replied on the 7th of January 1943, stating that he was going to support unconditional surrender. So Roosevelt didn't randomly come up with the idea. Then, on the 14th of January 1943, Churchill met with Roosevelt at Casablanca and cabled home informing the cabinet that unconditional surrender was on the cards. In other words, there was no hesitation or surprise on his part. The cabinet replied that they didn't want to exclude Italy due to the effects on the Balkans and Turkey, but almost everyone was on board. Okay, but why did the Allies come up with the idea of unconditional surrender? Well, there were actually numerous reasons. The first was that they had tried the whole armistice thing in 1918, and it had failed. The Allies simply didn't want to repeat the mistake of 1918, where the Germans surrendered on one set of promises that, in the end, proved impossible to the Allies to implement after the ceasefire. Wilson's 14 points and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles made the Germans believe that they had been tricked into surrendering in the First World War. German and Keynesian propaganda then made the other powers think that this was what happened, even though it hadn't, and that the Germans were guilty for the war. The Germans then used this belief to skirt around most of the punishments supposedly given to them by the Treaty of Versailles. Well, as I showed in my Weimar hyperinflation series, the Treaty of Versailles did not lead to the hyperinflation or the Nazis, because it turns out that the Germans never actually paid the reparations. There was also no war guilt clause in the treaty. That was German propaganda. But the myth of Versailles was widely believed, as was the idea brought about by the German Revolution of 1918 that the Germans had been stabbed in the back by the Jews. But there was no stab in the back. The German army had been defeated by 1918 and was in the process of collapse. Yet, by signing the armistice when they did, the German army could then claim it wasn't defeated and that it had been the home front that had collapsed. Well, the Allies wanted to avoid another stab in the back myth from emerging, so yes, a peace without victory had been tried in the First World War, and it had failed. Therefore, why would anyone assume another peace without victory would work in the Second World War? Thus, fighting until the very end, the simultaneous total destruction of the German army and the home front, was the best way to prevent another stab in the back myth from occurring. The real issue of wartime policy was therefore not the wisdom of refusing to define terms of surrender, but the wisdom of insisting on breaking the military power of Germany more clearly and durably than had been done in 1918. Nevertheless, the Allies were in two minds about this. There was a debate that had been raging since 1939 as to whether they should take a hard or soft stance on Germany. It was pointed out that the Treaty of Versailles had been hard at first, but then gradually softened until it was a failure. The other soft policy, appeasement, in the 1930s, had also been a failure, so there was evidence that being soft on Germany wasn't going to work. It was soon realised that the German people hadn't just embraced Hitler and Nazism, but Prussian militarism too. Thus, if the Allies and Soviets didn't destroy the big landowners in the East and the industrialists in the West, another war would probably occur in the future. To prevent this outcome, Stalin wanted to split Germany up, with Austria becoming a separate state once more, East Prussia would go to Poland, and the Sudetenland would revert back to Czechoslovakia. Thus, a hard stance was required to prevent another war. But there were other challenges. Several governments in exile were in Britain, and none of them could really agree on what a peace treaty with Germany would look like. Most of them demanded a hard solution, as did the Soviets, who had to be included in any peace deal. Therefore, the peace was going to be so complex that there was no way they could flesh it all out beforehand. It was best to wait until after the conflict was over before trying to figure out what to do. So giving a precise statement of intention during the war would prove impossible to make, since all the different powers saw things differently and had different war aims. Any argument between the factions might be exploited by the Germans, who would try to stave off complete destruction or even ally with one power or another. It therefore made sense for the Allies not to reveal their hand too early. And in order to win, the Allies needed to keep the Soviets on side, and the Soviets definitely wanted a hard peace. In fact, the Soviets threatened to negotiate with the Germans on several occasions and used those threats to gain concessions from the Western Allies. Therefore, a soft peace was off the table, and since a soft peace was off the table, the Germans wouldn't have accepted a hard peace anyway. Thus, the policy of unconditional surrender allowed them to hide their true intentions from the Germans and let them think a soft peace might still be on the table. Plus, a break with the Soviets at any point would have split the British coalition government and country right down the middle, since the Labour Party were pro-Soviet and socialist. So unconditional surrender not only didn't promise the Germans anything, but it bridged the gap between all the various factions. In other words, unconditional surrender was a compromise. It united everyone while the war was still going on and left the post-war policy until after the fighting had ended. That is the core element of the whole idea. There are other factors too. Allied propaganda was incredibly successful in painting the enemy as evil and the source of the conflict. Since the war is viewed as a massive struggle of the forces of good against the forces of evil, no compromise is thinkable. Compromise is possible only between human beings who recognise each other as human, as mutually fallible, not between abstract forces, and most certainly not between abstract good and evil. Without this compromise, without this conditional surrender, there could only be unconditional surrender. The battered and bruised people back home wouldn't have accepted peace without punishment. And this ties into the argument that has been made that the Nazi government would have accepted a conditional surrender if it had been allowed to remain in power. But in such a scenario, Germany wouldn't have been split up, and there was no way that the Allies or Soviets would have accepted a Nazi government in power in Germany after all that had happened. So a conditional surrender simply wouldn't have been accepted by the Germans, let alone the Allies and Soviets. In fact, the Germans themselves believed this. The German commanders knew that the Allies wouldn't accept peace with the Nazi regime, and that another stab-in-the-back myth might emerge with the soldiers at the front unless favourable terms could be made. This is why the July 1944 bomb plot was a massive risk. The German colonels who were willing to go through with the assassination attempt against Hitler wanted to remove the Nazi regime and to call for peace with the West, but they were concerned that they might invoke another stab-in-the-back legend. So they believed that if the Allies could reassure them that a soft peace was on the cards, they would be seen by their fellow countrymen as having saved Germany from total ruin, rather than being seen as betrayers who had delivered Germany into the hands of conquerors who would divide and spoil the country in a hard peace. If the Allies told them that their aim was to disband the German military and central government, split the country into 3 occupied districts, and that huge chunks of German territory were going to be taken from her, the German colonels might have had second thoughts. For the colonels to win over the military, they couldn't admit that the German military was going to be disbanded, otherwise the military wouldn't have been won over. Also, they only wanted peace with the West and wanted to continue the war in the East. They also hoped that the West might provide them with some support in their fight against the Bolsheviks. So the policy of unconditional surrender allowed the July 1944 plot to take place, which in turn may have resulted in an early surrender had it not failed. But then again, it might have led to another stab in the back legend, so it was a very dangerous policy for the Allies to pursue. And it has been suggested that a successful assassination of Hitler in 1943 or 44 may have led to civil war or a SS regime, neither of which would have resulted in anything other than a fight to the death. 3 German field marshals have recorded their opinion that Germany had lost all chance of achieving strategic victory in the war after the Stalingrad disaster, that they would have considered a compromise solution at that time intelligent. After the defeat of the German and Italian forces in North Africa in spring 1943, Rommel concluded unequivocally that the German cause was hopeless. By July 1944, dozens of German generals on both the Eastern and Western Front concluded that total eventual defeat of the Wehrmacht had become inevitable. It's these same generals that later insisted that it was the policy of unconditional surrender that made them keep fighting. Had the Allies been willing to negotiate, they said, the war could have been over perhaps 2 years sooner. It is true that these generals would, in July 1944, have been willing to accept the surrender of all territory gained by conquest, payment of reparations, plus disarmament, and a trial of war criminals. But this peace would have only been with the West alone. Kesselring, although not approached in regard to the July 1944 plot, writes that he would not have participated as long as the alternative to Hitler remained unconditional surrender. Manstein agreed, and both Guderian and Jodl gave as explicit reasons for their refusal to cooperate with the plot the alternative of unconditional surrender. This is because they wanted the war to continue in the East, and it also highlights that the Allies needed to crush the German military establishment entirely because these people just wanted to wage war. They needed to be thoroughly defeated and thrown out. Conditional surrender would have only proven them correct, and Churchill himself says conditional surrender would have only strengthened them. The use of the expression unconditional surrender, although widely hailed at the time, has since been described by various authorities as one of the greatest mistakes of Anglo-American war policy. It is said that it prolonged the struggle and made recovery afterwards more difficult. I do not believe that this is true. Indeed, my principal reason for opposing, as I always did, an alternative statement on peace terms, which was so often urged, was that a statement of the actual conditions on which the 3 great allies would have insisted, and would have been forced by public opinion to insist, would have been far more repulsive to any German peace movement than the general expression unconditional surrender. I remember several attempts being made to draft peace conditions which would satisfy the wrath of the conquerors against Germany. They looked so terrible when set forth on paper, and so far exceeded what was in fact done, that their publication would only have stimulated German resistance. They had in fact only to be written out to be withdrawn. Yes, it has been assumed that unconditional surrender prolonged the war by not laying out the terms of the peace, and thus forced the Allies and Soviets to fight all the way to Berlin. But what's often missed is that if the Allies and Soviets had insisted on a harsh conditional surrender, The Germans may have been incentivized to fight even more rigorously than they otherwise did. In other words, rather than unconditional surrender prolonging the Second World War, it actually shortened it. In addition, there is evidence, including from the US Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service of the Federal Communications Commission, that the idea of unconditional surrender was rarely used in German propaganda, despite Goebbels writing about it in his diaries. In fact, Goebbels didn't want to admit that the Allied aim was unconditional surrender, since unconditional surrender didn't imply the destruction of Germany, the sending of millions of Germans to Siberia, the castration of all German males, or the captivity of all German children, which is what he was saying was going to happen. Admitting that unconditional surrender was the actual policy would have undermined his propaganda, not strengthened it. And that's why there's evidence that unconditional surrender didn't dissuade the German troops from surrendering en masse to the Western powers. It simply wasn't a factor in whether the soldiers themselves surrendered or not. It was more that they just didn't want to surrender to the Soviets. This is precisely why the war dragged on after Hitler's death. Already on 2nd of May 1945, Dönitz laid down his aims. The only policy was to try to negotiate a series of partial surrenders in the West, while continuing the fight in the East, at least until as many Germans as possible, soldiers and civilians, could be rescued from the clutches of the Soviets. The military situation is hopeless, the minutes of the first meeting of his administration began. In the current situation, the main aim of the government has to be to save as many German people as possible from destruction through Bolshevism. Insofar as the Anglo-Saxons oppose this aim, they must also be combated. In the East, therefore, continuation of the struggle with all available means was required, while ending the war against the Anglo-Saxons was desirable to avoid further sacrifice. This was blocked, however, Dönitz went on, by the Allied demand for unconditional total surrender, which would mean, at a stroke, handing over millions of soldiers and civilians to the Russians. The aim was, therefore, capitulation only to the Western powers, but since their political conditions made this impossible, it had to be attempted through partial actions at the level of the army groups, utilising existing contacts. On the 6th of May, Dönitz's government tried to seek peace with the West. Eisenhower insisted on unconditional surrender, prompting a meeting between Dönitz, Keitel, Jodl and Gauleiter-Wegener. The Germans wanted to surrender, but they couldn't, because to do so would abandon millions of their men to the Soviets. They therefore proposed a surrender to the West only, but Eisenhower stubbornly refused anything other than unconditional surrender. So Dönitz had no choice but to accept unconditional surrender on the 7th of May 1945. The fighting continued for another 48 hours though, before the surrender would take effect, and this gave the Germans time to get as many men to the West as possible. So there's a couple of points to note here. Yes, arguably, Dönitz kept fighting for several days longer than he otherwise would have done had the Western Allies accepted a conditional surrender. However, you've got to appreciate that Dönitz only wanted peace with the West, not the Soviets, so the war would have continued. That was the main point of all this. They were already willing to surrender en masse to the Western Allies, which they did even though the policy of unconditional surrender was in effect. Without unconditional surrender, the Allies may have made peace with Germany earlier than they did, and the Germans and Soviets would have continued fighting for much longer, since the troops on the Western Front would have been freed up to go and fight in the East. So, rather than prolonging the war, as is often claimed, unconditional surrender actually shortened the war. And apart from delaying the end for a few more days, it wasn't a deciding factor for why the Germans kept fighting. There were also those in the British camp, including Basil Lyndall Hart, who actually argued that the Soviets were a big threat, and that Soviet imperialistic expansion might occur after the war with Germany. He and others believed that Germany was the only state in Europe capable of checking the Soviet advance, concluding that Germany's aggressive power had been broken, but that it could now be used as a defensive force. Destroying the German army completely only strengthened the Red Army, and it also didn't make strategic sense to allow the Soviets to reach the Rhine. Since the British viewed the war as a means to prevent one power from dominating Europe, it made sense to now turn against the Soviet Union, which was why Churchill urged Roosevelt to capture Berlin as well as the Balkans. The Americans, of course, didn't see things the same way as the British, believing that the war had to be waged with full cooperation with the Soviets. But you can see how unconditional surrender actually strengthened the Allied cause by bringing them further into Germany and checking Soviet expansion. If they had accepted peace before this point, the Iron Curtain would have come down on the French border. After 1941 then, there could be no talk of anything other than unconditional surrender if the West wanted to stop the Soviets from dominating Europe. Thus, far from being a policy that prolonged the war, unconditional surrender actually shortened it. At the very least, it was the only policy that could keep the various Allied and Soviet factions together while the war was still going on. And the alternative really wasn't an alternative. To me, this is a classic example of the seen and the unseen. People just take the first thing they see, don't think about it in any depth, and then run with it. Oh, unconditional surrender means that there's no compromise, therefore it prolonged the war. When in reality, when you take the time to look behind the curtain, you see that it was the best policy available and that it most likely shortened the war. Historians and students of history shouldn't just do a surface level analysis and take things at face value. They need to dive deeper to figure out why things happened. And the unconditional surrender policy of the Second World War is a great example of why thinking critically when studying history is so important. Thanks for watching, bye for now.